Well, we're going to leave it there for that conversation. Coming up next, though, we're going to turn our attention to the watchdog group Citizens Against Government Waste. They've put out their annual pig book detailing wasteful government spending. We'll dig into those numbers with the group's president, Thomas Schatz.
Washington Journal continues.
We want to welcome back Thomas Schatz, who's the president of the Citizens Against Government Waste, here to talk about the 26th annual Citizens Against Government Waste 2018 Congressional Pig Book Summary, the book Washington doesn't want you to read. Mr. Schatz, what's the takeaway?
In 2018, the year that spending was supposed to be reduced, Congress decided to approve the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, 13% increase in total discretionary spending. But earmarks have always been a bipartisan expenditure, so they increased by more than 116%. In other words, more than doubled between 2017, when they spent $6.8 billion, more than doubled to $14.7 billion in 2018. This, of course, under the moratorium on earmarks.
How do you define an earmark?
We define it differently than Congress. That's one of the reasons we're still finding them.
Okay, so how do you define it?
There are 7 criteria. I'll mention a few. One is whether the project is competitively awarded, whether it was authorized, whether it was added only by the House or only the Senate, whether it serves a local or a special interest.
So when you say is a 116% increase in the cost of earmarks, these provisions written into these bills fit into one of those categories, or all of them?
At least one.
At least
Most
one.
of them are more than one, but it's at least one. And this definition was created in 1991 in conjunction with the bipartisan Congressional Pork Busters Coalition. So this used to be, quote-unquote, pork barrel spending. Now it's earmarks. It's all the same thing.
Congress says they're not doing earmarks anymore. They've been banned. Remind our viewers why they were banned, and how do they define them now that they say they're not being used?
In 2006, there was a record $29 billion in earmarks in the appropriations bills. That was CAGW's pig book. In the prior year, the highway bill had $25 billion in earmarks, including that infamous bridge to nowhere in Alaska. People were very upset. Republicans lost the majority in 2006. They got it back in 2010, and one of the first things they did was to agree to a moratorium on earmarks. President Obama agreed, and eventually the Democratic Senate agreed. And since then, of course, the Republicans have continued to hold Congress, yet this past year they decided, oh, well, let's not extend the moratorium in the House, while the Senate did agree to do so. Their definition is slightly different than ours. It does not include, for example, if it's in the president's budget, which we include, and whether it's authorized, which we also include.
Well, how can you include it if it's in the president's budget? Because that doesn't necessarily become law. It's just his request.
Right. Well, in most cases, it's when they exceed the president's budget. It's not just that there is no request in some cases. A good example is the East-West Center in Hawaii. Been around since 1960. The State Department didn't want it. This year, the president didn't request it. The House said no for the first time in many years. It was added back in by Senator Brian Schatz, who's no relation, Democratic senator from Hawaii, and that follows the tradition of his predecessors who kept funding this program and agency, which duplicates everything the State Department does. It's supposed to improve relations with Pacific and Asian nations. That's the State Department's job. More than half of the money for that operation comes from the taxpayers. There's no competition. There are no other centers applying to the State Department for money.
Here are some other examples found in this 2018 Congressional Pig Book. $2.7 billion for 20 additional F-35 Joint Strike Fighter aircraft, $859 million for 14 earmarks for the Army Corps of Engineers, $210 million for National Pre-Disaster Mitigation Fund, $66.5 million for National Endowment for Democracy, $65 million for Pacific Coastal Salmon Recovery, and $54.7 million for entrepreneurial development programs within Small Business Administration, almost $50 million for rural hospital flexibility grants, $30 million for Maritime Guaranteed Loan Program, $13 million for Save America's Treasure Grants Program, and $10 million for high energy cost grants within the Rural Utilities Service. Are these all bad?
It's how they're added into the budget. It's not that they're all bad. This is not about the merits of these programs, although in some cases they're clearly wasteful, and have been identified as wasteful by the Government Accountability Office or the Congressional Budget Office. So this is a process. This is what the Congressional Pork Busters Coalition and CAGW looked at and said, these are projects added in mostly by the Appropriations Committee members that are not competitively awarded, not considered in the normal budget process. So a quick example, if you look at the Save America's Treasures grants, $13 million, they hadn't earmarked that between 2010 and 2017. Last year, $5 million, this year, $13 million. In the years between 2008 and 10, when they identified the names of the members in the appropriations bills, 200 members of Congress added 177 of these earmarks worth $34 million. 20% of them were for local operas, opera houses, theaters, museums. One of those was caused the demise of Congressman Alan Mollahan of West Virginia. He gave $150,000 to the Cotrill Opera House run by a former aide. There was corruption involved. Members of Congress went to jail over earmarks. Lobbyists went to jail over earmarks. It's a corruptive, unfair process. And one more quick number is the 81 House and Senate appropriators during those 3 years, they're 15% of the Congress. They got 51% of the earmarks and 61% of the money. It's corruptive, it's costly, and it's inequitable.
You've been doing this for 26 years.
Yes.
Senator Flake tweeting out this week, "What am I doing? This pig can't even read." Senator Flake backing what you all do with this pig book. But what results do you get year after year by highlighting this? Does any of this, the waste, then ultimately get stripped out because you shine a light on it?
Well, it was very instrumental in getting the moratorium. It wasn't just CAGW. There were other organizations involved, leaders on this issue like Senator Flake and Senator McCain, Senator Toomey, Senator Ernst, Senator McCaskill have a Earmark Elimination Act. They should be banned permanently. The problem with the moratorium, of course, is that it's just a suspension of the process. Members in the House were trying to push it back in. That's why the House didn't extend the moratorium. So we had the moratorium. It's still, at this point, a little bit less than half of the record $29 billion. So while it's going in the wrong direction, it's not as corruptive as it was. The names are not attached. There's a little more lack of transparency in that case. We're not suggesting they add their names back in and bring it all back. But I think a lot of members understand, especially those that were there in 2006, that this is a really bad idea.
Well, I wonder what our viewers have to say and what your questions are about government spending. Here are the phone numbers. Democrats 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, and Independents 202-748-8002. Thomas Schatz, who said, as he said, been doing this for a long time, here to take your questions and your comments about government spending, the waste that they uncover in their pig books every year. Hattie in Houston, Democrat, go ahead.
Yes, I'm commenting on him, and I think it's just too much spending, too much waste lately on this, and you know the rich is getting richer because they owe a lot of stuff here, and the poor people they're cutting that, but then they have all of this with these people. You know, we don't need this. We don't need these private planes. We don't need all of this, and here's these poor people's need. For the, you know, their kids could go to school and eat properly. They're cutting off of the poor peoples, and they just letting the rich go crazy. For instance, Trump and his family, they are all sitting there, all his children, and you know everything is.
Okay, Hattie. Well, let me ask it this way of Tom Schatz: do earmarks only benefit the rich?
No. In fact, the problem is that they adversely affect programs that need the money. When this money is moved away from a higher priority, then the people that truly need the money aren't getting it. That's true of all wasteful spending. Government Accountability Office every year issues a report on duplication and overlap. One of those areas is science and math programs, STEM programs, more than 150 of them, which means that we're not getting the results that we should be getting because they're just not doing what they should do. That was one of the issues. If you have 45 people doing the same thing, you're not going to get a good result.
Johnny in Charleston, South Carolina, Republican.
Okay, my name is Johnny Williams. I live in South Carolina, Charleston, and you talking about an oversight. Charleston needs an oversight like you can believe. I'm a veteran. I go to the hospital. They're building a hospital here. I mean, no, they're building a garage here. It's been 3 years, not actually 4 years. They're still building this garage. It don't take no 4 years to build a garage. Somebody is having a kickback or something. because it's ridiculous. Because then they live in a flooded area. If it's a flood down there in the VA, you can't get down there because it's flooded.
Okay, Johnny, I think he's talking about government contracts.
Right.
How does that factor into what you do when you highlight this government spending?
Well, we also issue a report called Prime Cuts, which identifies $2.3 trillion over 5 years that could be saved by eliminating wasteful spending, more than enough to balance the budget, all from sources here in Washington, D.C. The ideas are out there. The inefficiency is unfortunately built into government at many levels. I think most people believe that state and local governments are generally more efficient. They need to balance their budgets. They're closer to the people. And I think people feel that they have a little more control over local spending as well.
How have Republicans done in the last year and a half of being in control of Congress compared to previous years?
Well, we weren't happy with the Bipartisan Budget Act, 13% increase overall in discretionary spending. That was not something that I thought Republicans would do. And I think taxpayers are very upset about that. So you had a 13% increase in overall discretionary spending. Then you have a 116% increase in earmarks. And I think people look and say, what's the difference between Democrats and Republicans? Republicans like spending money on defense. Democrats like spending money on other things.
Is it logical that if there's more spending, there's more earmarks? They tend to follow?
Well, in this case, it did. Some people have said that earmarks grease the wheels for things to get done, but that I don't think, as you see and people know, this led to the corruption in the 2006-2008 period, and eventually Republicans said, let's not do it anymore. There were enough of them holding back the effort to try to get them started again, particularly Mark Walker, who's the head of the Republican Study Committee, and others, and so they're just saying, look, this is still not a good idea.
We'll go to Delano in Conway, Missouri, independent.
Hey, thank you very much for C-SPAN. This is my favorite subject right here, waste, fraud, and abuse. And the swamp, both parties are into it up to their necks. We cannot have the swamp auditing the swamp. We're going to have to come up with an independent, totally out of this world, independent audit to run in and start doing these military. Well, Ronald Reagan, when he got W.R. Grace to do the audit on the military-industrial complex, he was shot 6 weeks into his presidency. It's a dangerous situation, and I want to know, Tom Schatz, I can't pronounce your name.
Tom Schatz.
Do you have a book out? That's what I'm interested in.
Yes, we have a book. It's the Congressional Pig Book. And by the way, Citizens Against Government Waste was created by J. Peter Grace and Jack Anderson, following up on the Grace Commission under President Reagan.
And tell our viewers a little bit more who don't remember that.
Well, the Grace Commission was a study proposed and then funded privately by companies all over the country. They made 2,478 recommendations to save $424 billion over 3 years. It was the last comprehensive study of the federal government from 1982 to 84. Peter Grace and Jack Anderson co-founded CAGW subsequently, and we've helped save more than $1 trillion since then.
How do you track who's behind these earmarks? Can you?
We used to be able to do that when they had the names in the back of the appropriations bills. Then before that and subsequently, we look for comments by members. That's how we know Senator Schatz took credit for the East-West Center, and we also know because he's been doing it for years. Senator Patty Murray said she helped get that $65 million for the Pacific Coast Salmon Recovery Fund. So it's a lot more difficult now to find out exactly who's behind these projects.
What are some other notable earmarks?
Now, there's $17 million for the Asia Foundation, another program that duplicates what the State Department does. They have hundreds of donors around the world. Governments and non-governmental organizations fund them as well. Another good example of operation that should be funded totally by the private sector.
Steve, in California, Republican.
Hello. I used to live in a very rural town. The county seat was, and the trauma center was 235 miles away from the county seat. Most people would be flown to Las Vegas on helicopters if they were in a life or death situation, being rescued in an accident. And the rural hospital that was in the town, the company, they built a new hospital over in Arizona where you talk about John McCain and Jeff Flake, they're senators. Well, that company just took like their best equipment. They abandoned the hospital. The city had to purchase a hospital so people could have care. Part of that hospital was on BLM land, so you had transition with federal government there. They finally found a buyer. People were going miles and miles just to get health care. Then you have the insurance problems. Like there was one dentist in the town, he didn't want to take people's insurance, so you had to go between 95 and 144 miles just to see a dentist. And I don't think taking away money from small little hospitals is a good idea. I think that's totally un-American that you're saying that people that live in small little towns don't have the right to health care. That's just crazy to me. You know, so what justifies Senator McCain and Flake, you know, taking money from people and then saying that, well, we're going to close down your hospitals because we don't want to fund rural health care. And a lot of Arizona's got rural populations.
Okay, Steve, I'll leave it there. Mr. Schatz, do you have any thoughts on that and what you're hearing?
Well, I think a lot of what they're trying to do is to have, you know, telehealth is a good way now to try to get people to get health care. You can go to a doctor and then literally go home and stay in touch. Federal Communications Commission is working on that, so they're actually announcing some plans for that this week. We think that's a really good way to help people at less cost, but yet give them access to what they need.
We'll go to Gold Hill, Oregon. Darlene, Democrat.
Yeah, I have a question about this parade that the president wants and to have Putin attend the parade. What the cost will be, and will that come out of the military spending budget, the over $700 billion that Congress has given the military? And also, second question, what is it costing for security for that event if it were to happen?
Mr. Schatz, have you guys been looking at that?
We are not excited about the military parade, I can tell you that. I don't think it's such a great use of our tax dollars.
Kathy in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, independent.
Yes, hi. Thank you for taking my call. I wanted to expand upon a little bit of what the caller said from California about needing emergency care from a dentist or a hospital. I work at a dentist office. I also have had my share of bad experiences that are somewhat a product of modern society, violent crime, that kind of thing. And I care very much for the environment, and I'm very curious about how Thomas orders the importance of things, because to me, on the most basic level, you take care of people, you take care of the planet. You order things based on what needs to be done first, and I get very disturbed when people don't think it's important to care for the environment and don't think it's important to care for people who need emergencies. I really think it's important that we elevate the state of the environment to emergency level, the problems that we're having.
Kathy, understand. Let's have Mr. Schatz talk about priorities.
Well, we look at everything that the federal government is involved with, and in some cases we think issues should be dealt with more closer to home. I think education is incredibly important. My entire generation grew up without a Department of Education, seem to be doing pretty well. And I think that should be moved back to the local level the way it was many, many years ago. Every state wants to educate their kids now. It's not like the 60s anymore.
Have you taken a look at the budget director, White House budget director, Mick Mulvaney's plan to reorganize the government? And what kind of impact, first explain the highlights of that, and then what kind of impact could that have on government spending?
Well, we were involved in that. We met with Director Mulvaney several times with his staff as well to talk about what should be done. We gave them the recommendations from our prime cuts from the Pig Book and other ideas as well. The recommendations came out about a month ago. I just mentioned education. One idea is to merge the education and labor departments into essentially a workforce department. Because if you don't put those two things together, if you're not educating our kids to match the jobs that are in the economy today, then you're going to have kids who are educated but can't work in the areas that we need people to work in. I mean, right now you have as many people looking for work as there are jobs, maybe more jobs than people at this point, which is great for the economy and great for the country. But if that isn't matched up, then you're going to have wasted expenditures in the education field.
What other ideas do you think from his reorganization plan could work?
The Department of the Interior is working on reorganizing its regions along watersheds and natural boundaries, which makes a lot more sense. Moving employees out to the states The government owns more than half of the land in the West. People should be out there working more closely with the departments and agencies at the state level so that they can coordinate what they're doing. It makes common sense.
Wes in Norwood, North Carolina, Democrat.
Hey, thank you for taking my call. I wanted to ask Mr. Schultz with his book. The Trump administration has undone a lot of the environmental action protection stuff that Obama had put in place. And what, if any, are any cuts to the EAP that has happened under the Trump administration?
Well, EPA has reduced its staff. They have, again, tried to move a lot of these programs and operations out to the states. And I think in a lot of cases, there was a lot of over-regulation. And that doesn't happen just in one administration. It happens over time. I mentioned, again, the Interior Department hasn't been reorganized in 150 years. Clearly, something needs to be done. And a lot of those things that can be done administratively, it doesn't mean that they're not going to do what they're supposed to do, and it doesn't mean they're going to take things away. One of the interesting arguments you get on Capitol Hill is making the point to people that like to spend our money, if you spent it more efficiently, you could help more people. The answer in Washington is always, let's create a program to fix the problem. That's not how all of us think. If we have a problem, we think about how to fix it. Then what do you need in order to do that? Like, what are your resources? If you can't and you don't have the resources, you just don't do what you're supposed to do. But in Washington, all this money is sitting there, and they tend to spend it.
A couple tweets for you. First, what is the average cost for companies to administer a government contract? Second tweet, in fairness, some of the things that increase the cost of government projects at all levels are the laws enacted to protect against corruption in government spending, the bidding and contracting process.
Well, bidding and contracting has been an issue for many, many years. And going back to Secretary Rumsfeld, when he was running the Defense Department, he tried to fix the procurement process. The Cohn-Klinger Act has been around for many, many years in order to try to address these issues with procurement, particularly at defense. We talked earlier about the Joint Strike Fighter. You mentioned it, $2.7 billion. 7 years behind schedule. It's more than doubled in cost, and it doesn't work very well. The Secretary of the Air Force said we should never build a plane at the same time you're designing it. You should have designed it first, then built it. So they tried it. It's not working so well.
Yet they're giving more money to it. So who's behind the increase in the F-35s?
It would be the members of Congress in whose districts the F-35 is being built. One of the reasons why these large defense contracts are spread around the country. Everybody has a little piece of this.
We'll go to Kelly, North Royalton, Ohio, Independent.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I want to understand if there's any tracking completed or done on the executive branch, and especially across the administration. I'm very disturbed about the cost and the expense of Trump going to his golf resorts every weekend, and I want to understand the impact and the expense of that. Do you track it?
It's really hard to track. This has always been true. Executive expenditures are not as transparent as congressional expenditures. That's one of the issues that came up with all the travel. Now, obviously, between Tom Price and Scott Pruitt, there was abuse, and they're both gone. But these are all usually approved by career employees at the agencies. They all have different rules. We wrote about this a while ago, right after the Tom Price situation. You need to have transparency. You need to have consistent rules across the agencies. When is it really necessary not to fly commercial? And then you need to let people know why you're doing it.
What about Scott Pruitt at the EPA and his spending?
Well, he's left, so that was certainly one of the things that caused his demise, and the same with Tom Price. It's unfortunate that when people come to Washington, sometimes they tend to get what we call Potomac fever. On Capitol Hill, that means you're going to spend a lot of money. In the agencies, it appears to mean that you're going to use it to help go home and watch your kid play baseball, which is unfortunate.
So there's not, the Inspector General or the Ethics Office doesn't have a say over how the money is spent by a cabinet secretary?
They usually look at it after the fact. They don't pre-approve the travel. That's left up to the career bureaucrats.
Cindy in Fort Lauderdale, Democrat.
Good morning. Mr. Schatz, you're wrong on three things, and I will point them out to you. I know because I've lived them, and I'm a product of them. First of all, the education. You do not tell students who have natural abilities, and we all have some natural ability. So we're attracted to a particular field of study. To go work at the electric company when they don't have aptitude for it, so that when a storm comes, they actually blow a breaker. You're wrong about education, sir. You're right about it being local, but it should never be designed solely for the companies in that area. We're a big country, and you don't necessarily have to spend your life living in one place, growing up, getting your education, and then living there forever. So you're wrong about that. The second thing you're wrong about, yes, there is cost for emergency visits and dentists and doctors. However, and unfortunately, I am disabled and I had to sue to get Medicaid. The doctors, especially the dentists, I was stunned when I was asked in the first time seeing that person to fill out a loan agreement as part of my incoming paperwork because the insurance companies weren't covering what they were supposed to do. And I said, no, I'm not filling it out. So then the doctor proceeds with the examination, tells me all that needs to be done, and then puts in a claim for drugs only, no procedures, fails to clean the teeth when a filling had fallen out. And it's not that I don't take care of my teeth.
Okay, Cindy, so we're running short on time. What's your point?
Then on this government spending with the military, these broad umbrellas sometimes are used for in case you need to do something else later, and sometimes they're just for wasteful spending. So
okay, I'm going to have Mr. Schatz jump in.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just on the first point quickly, I certainly never said that people should stay in one place their whole lives. I was talking more about vocational education is something that people should take a closer look at. Of course, you should do what you'd like to do and take that opportunity. It's one of the reasons why I don't like the Department of Education, because they have national standards. That's one of the big problems we have.
Well, Mr. Schatz, our viewers can find the Pig Book if they go to CAGW.org. You can find it there and dig into the numbers a little more deeper if you'd like. We always appreciate the conversation with you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.